Yep.
Well, Shabbat Shalom and welcome back. We are delighted to welcome back our dear teacher and friend, Rabbi Hillel Silverman. Hillel, welcome back. Good Shabbos.
Thank you. Good Shabbos. I'm happy to be back.
This week, Shabbos Shira, the Shabbat of the song, the Shabbat of the crossing of the Red Sea, the Shabbat of the manna. Teach us about this week's Parsha.
It's a very, very interesting parsha. Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, the most important event outside of the theophany on Mount Sinai of the Jewish people. Historical event. It's in our liturgy and our prayers. It's all over the place. We have a special holiday, Passover, commemorating the Exodus from Egypt. When they left Egypt, they were ready to travel, and Moses is told not to go the short way to the Holy Land. Ki karovu, because the Holy Land, the Promised Land, was very close. If he went due south, maybe a week, maybe 10 days to walk, maybe 2 weeks. But he took the long way. He took the way east, and he went years and years in the wilderness to reach the Holy Land. It's very important that you take a long way and not a shortcut. The Bible said if they took the short way, Pharaoh would have attacked, the people would have been disheartened, they would have wanted to return to Egypt. So they took the long way. And in life too, to reach the promised land of our dreams, we need to take not shortcuts, but the long way. For education, it takes a long, long time to educate oneself. Marriage is no way to go a shortcut, nor is parenthood or anything else that is worthwhile. It takes thought, it takes dedication, it takes energy. And our rabbis tell us when the children of Israel reached the Red Sea, and they were in between the waves of the ocean and the troops and the chariots of Pharaoh, and they didn't know what to do. And there were 4 different groups of Israelites at that moment, and they didn't know, should they, number 1, return to Egypt, or number 2, fight back at the Egyptians, or number 3, commit suicide, or number 4, make peace. They couldn't do any of them. And so at the Red Sea, and by the way, it's not the Red Sea, it's Yam Suf, which is the Sea of Reeds in the Akkadian language, but we'll call it the Red Sea. And at the Red Sea, God rebukes Moses. Ma titzak alai. Why do you cry out to me, Moses? And of course, Moses is not crying. Moses is praying. And the rabbis are embarrassed that God would rebuke Moses for praying. So the rabbis say, "Eit lehit palel, the eit la'asot." There's a time to pray, and there is a time to do. Prayer is not worthwhile if it does not lead to action. Prayer and action go together. Then again, it's good to have prayer with action. But at this instant, the rabbis say God told Moses that this was a time for action. Daber el bnei Israel Yisau, speak to the children of Israel that they go forward and cross the sea. Action. The rabbis in the Midrash tell us many interesting things about the crossing of the Red Sea, and makes really the Bible more enlivening. For one thing, the children of Israel stood at the waters of the sea, we'll call it the Red Sea, and Moses told them to go forward, but they were afraid to go forward. And one man, says the Midrash, Nachshon ben Amidav, Nachshon plunged into the sea, and they watched. And he plunged into the sea, and the water came up to his neck. And then gradually the water declined, went down to his waist, declined, went down to his knees, declined, and went to his footsteps. And then the children plunged in. In Israel today, Nachshon is a very, very special word. Many places, many buildings, many businesses One of the fine brigades in the Israeli army is called Nachshon, in memory of the hero who plunged in first. Another midrash. The rabbis tell us the angels in heaven were witnessing, and they saw from the heavens the children of Israel being engulfed by the waters of the Red Sea. And they began to cheer and they began to applaud. And God rebuked the angels and he said, "How dare you applaud and rejoice when my children, the Egyptians also, my children, are drowning?" And this, of course, speaks for the Rahmanut of the Jewish religion. And of course, we have the tradition at the Passover Seder that we remove 2 cups of 2 sips of wine before we recite the 10 plagues to remember the Egyptians who drowned. The rabbis tell us in the Midrash that there was a member of the troop of Israelites. His name was Dotan. And Dotan didn't like the walking journey over the Red Sea. His head was down and he was kvetching and he was kvetching and he was complaining. It's hot, it's cold, it's wet, it's not nice, it's smelly, the fish, I can't stand it. And then all of a sudden they reached the promised, the brightness of the land across from the Red Sea, and they were redeemed. And the rabbis tell us, Az Yashir, when they crossed the Red Sea, the children of Israel sang a song. Today it's called Shabbat Shirah, the song of the Sabbath, or the Sabbath song. Yashir, strangely enough, is future, it's not past. And they will sing, but they sang. And so the rabbis tell us they will sing again and again of survival, of victory, of accomplishment. The Jews in Egypt who crossed the Red Sea really were great optimists. They believed. Now, in the movie 10 Commandments, which appeared, 50, 60 years ago, if you haven't seen it, by the way, you should see it. But Charlton Heston, who played Moses, didn't resemble Moses to me. He was too tall. He was too handsome. He was too articulate. You remember Moses was tongue-tied. 2 aspects of the movie, which I enjoyed very much, was when the 10 Commandments were given to Moses, his hair overnight turned white. And in the movie, I remember the 10 Commandments are depicted as bolts of lightning, one after the other, which in a way is like the Bible text where it says Aseret Hadvarim, the 10 words or the 10 bolts of lightning. I remember when I went to the studio where the movie was done, there still was there the Dead Sea, the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea. It's an interesting movie. And as soon as they crossed the Red Sea, what happened? Miriam's sister took out her timbrels and her musical instruments and led the people in a dance of jubilation. Musical instruments? Where did Miriam procure musical instrument? Was there a music store on the other side of the West Bank? Not at all. Miriam, it doesn't say this in the Bible, but obviously Miriam brought musical instruments with her because she had the faith and the conviction and the courage that they would cross the Red Sea in safety, and then she would lead a dance of jubilation. Now, looking over Jewish history today and thinking of the Exodus from Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim, which occurred about 3,500 years ago, there have many, many pharaohs who have existed in the history of the Jewish people ever since. There were the pharaohs in Babylonia and the pharaohs in Rome, the pharaohs in Europe, the pharaohs in Poland, the pharaohs in Russia, the pharaohs in Syria, in Spain, the pharaohs in Germany, who oppressed the Jewish people, who imprisoned them, and who exiled them, exiled them. In our own day, we have also had a number of exiles from wicked pharaohs. I remember distinctly 2 of them. The one from Russia in our own time, and the one from Ethiopia, also an exile. I was personally involved in these exiles. Uh, I took 31 trips to Israel as an officer of the National UJA and as chairman of the Rabbinic Advisory Committee. We called many of them missions to Israel missions. I remember I went on one mission, just 48 hours, imagine, from California to Israel, just 48 hours. Because in Russia, and this was in our own time, but not many of us still remember it. It was in the 70s and the 80s, there was an exodus from Russia. This was almost 70 years ago. But there was in Russian history the Tsars and Stalin who oppressed the Jews of Russia. And there were millions of Jews living in Russia. They were not allowed to practice Judaism. They were tortured. They were exiled. They were imprisoned. And we talked all these days that we, in the United States, we said, let our people go. We had in those days, you may still remember it, in front of our synagogues, a large sign, let my people go. We petitioned our congressmen, our senators, even the presidents to use their influence on Russia to let the Jewish people go. And they finally went. There was an exodus, probably larger than the exodus we're reading about this morning from Egypt. Over 1 million Jews, maybe more, went to Israel and also to the United States. And they were able to live their lives as Jews again. Do you remember the term refusnik? Refusnik? You don't hear that term anymore. But in those days, and I'm talking about the 70s and the 80s, when Jews asked for freedom and liberty from Russia, many of them, most of them, were refused. And when they were refused, they lived in limbo. They had no status. They had no dignity. They had no honor. They were imprisoned. These were the refuseniks. I remember as a member of the UJA officer staff that we visited the refuseniks in Russia. In those days, it was not popular to be a tourist to Russia. But in some way, we got to Leningrad. And when we got out of the plane, we were taken by cabs. Oh, it must have been an hour and a half. We didn't know where we were going. We were in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly we found ourselves next to a large apartment house. And we went to the third floor of that apartment house, and here were 40 or 50 refuseniks. They were awaiting us. We came to give them our support, moral and physical. They didn't want money. They didn't want clothing. But do you know what the refuseniks in that apartment, Leningrad, desired? And we brought them mezuzahs, tefillin, Hebrew Bibles, Hebrew prayer books, Jewish objects. These were real heroes, these refuseniks. And we met these same people a year, 2 or 3 later. And most of them had reached Israel. And they were proud citizens of Israel. They were really learned to speak Hebrew. They were soon to become scientists, educators, businessmen, even millionaires, some of them. It was a great period in Jewish history. Another exodus, the refuseniks from Russia. Sharansky, Natan Sharansky, you remember that name? A symbol of the refuseniks. He was thrown into prison and he was in solitary confinement for 5 or 6 years. His wife, Avital, left 9 years before he was released and went to Israel. And I remember even when he was released and crossed the border, he was told, walk straight, don't deviate. He zigzagged on purpose. He was a proud man. He was a very, very wonderful man. And I never met Sharansky in Israel, but I did meet him in Los Angeles in my synagogue. He came for a visit, and I remember in the auditorium of Sinai Temple, he was met by other Russian refuseniks who had reached the United States, and they surrounded him. He was their hero. He was like Carlton Heston. He was their Moses. But refusenik is a very, very important word in our vocabulary, just as the word survivor. But in a few years, in 5 or 10 years, there will be no more refuseniks left, nor will there be any survivors from the Holocaust. That period will be over, and they will have outlived it, and we should remember them. So one exodus was the exodus from Russia. The second one at the same time, perhaps a little later, in the 80s, if you remember, was from Ethiopia. It was not as large, perhaps like 100,000 in two different waves, not a million people. And they had been in Ethiopia since the rule of King Solomon, over 2,000 years. And they were still fastidious about their Jewish religion. Their Judaism was a little different than ours, but it was Jewish. And they were rebelling. They wanted liberty. They wanted to return to Israel. And they finally made it. They went out and they reached Israel. I did visit the Ethiopians, not in Ethiopia, but in Israel when they first arrived. I joined them at their camps, at their mabarot, and I witnessed them learning to speak Hebrew and being taught how to dress in a modern land and taught the customs and ceremonies of Israel. And I visited them again a few later and discovered they were absorbed beautifully, proud, and they were taking part in citizenship in Israel. At the end of this morning's Sedra is the famous passage that the children of Israel were attacked soon after they crossed the Red Sea. And they were attacked by the Amalekites, Amalek in Hebrew, or Amalek in English. These were the mobs, these were the terrorists, and they surrounded the Jewish people and attacked them and began to wage war. They were in the valley fighting, and according to the Bible, Moses was in the mountains, on the hills, and he was lifting his arms. And when the children below fighting against the terrorists perceived Moses, their leader, with his arms raised, they persevered. But his arms became weary and they began to droop. And his brother Aaron and his brother-in-law married to Miriam, took each one an arm and raised his arm. And when his arms were raised, the children of Israel were victorious. And we should think, when we think about that first battle, we should remember the Battle of Amalek in Washington, D.C., the mobs just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. We should never forget them. The insurrection, the terrible insurrection, the first battle in Washington for over 200 years since the War of 1812. Who were these people, these Amalek people who were battling in Washington? They were white supremacists, they were neo-Nazis, they were racists, they were anti-Semites, they were people who wanted to overturn the government. They were organized. It's not that these people were not organized. Many of them knew exactly what they were doing. They entered Washington, D.C., and they began to plumage, and they began to steal, and they began to disturb and distress. They knew what they were doing, and not hundreds of them entered the Capitol building, but who knows how many, 1,000, over 1,000. They wanted to destroy, they wanted to kill, they wanted to kidnap congressmen, vice president. They were there for 3 hours. It's something that we will never, never forget. We were outraged. It was outrageous. It was despicable. It was disgusting. It was intolerable that they would do that, something we should not forget. We are a country of law and order, and should not have permitted these insurgents to enter our Capitol building. we have another chance to reestablish in our government, in our country, in our cities, harmony and peace and brotherhood. We need peaceful protests. Our disagreement is permitted in our country, but violence has no place. Violence should never be a priority. God bless our United States. Before it is too late, we should strengthen the precepts of democracy. We should freedom, justice, opportunity, human dignity. We must reinforce and re-strengthen our land of the free and our home of the brave. God bless America. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.
Oh, Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi. Thank you so much for your thoughts and for your insights, and I guess most especially for your passion. We wish you a very pleasant Shabbos and all of our blessings. Take good care. It's good to have you back.
Good to be back. Thank you very much.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.